Hello, it is Professor Nam Yong Lee's long-form editorial. If you try to buy time with Kim Jong-in again, the Freedom Conservative camp will collapse once more. Many media outlets report that after the Jang Dong-hyuk shipwreck, fierce controversy has erupted over whom the People Power Party should recommend as chair of its Emergency Leadership Committee. I believe this debate is not simply about whether to install one person or not, but about what kind of method the party chooses to establish accountability in a crisis. Recalling a familiar name whenever danger strikes may temporarily cover internal conflict and buy time, but it cannot restore public trust. Inside a political party, there are multiple actors: the leadership, factions, incumbent lawmakers, non-incumbents, nomination interests, core supporters, swing voters, the media, and public opinion. When these actors become entangled, the central relationship that rises to the surface is who bears responsibility. The more that relationship is blurred, the easier it becomes for entrenched interests to hide, the slower party reform becomes, and the more likely it is that the costs to livelihoods and national security are shifted onto the public. For that reason, I aim to break down the conditions under which the Kim Jong-in again camp moves, and to interpret, based on past facts, why repeating the same prescription increases the risk of recurrence. The timeline of Kim Jong-in's reappearances is evidence of a repeated call structure. During the 2012 general election period, Kim Jong-in served as a member of the Saenuri Party's Emergency Committee, and after nomination conflicts and internal clashes surfaced, he indicated an intention to step down from that role. I believe this shows that an emergency committee can become not only a crisis management body, but also a battlefield over nomination power. In 2016, he led the election as the head of the Democratic Party's emergency leadership, and major disputes followed over extending his term and over the leadership structure. When the savior relief pitcher model operates in a crisis, long-term institutional repair inside the organization is inevitably pushed backward. After the 2020 general election defeat, the Future United Party once again launched a Kim Jong-in emergency chairmanship, which then continued into the People Power Party's emergency leadership. I believe many will remember that when a crisis management card becomes fixed to one individual, it becomes harder for the party to build standing leadership and a standing policy engine on its own. The group pushing to elevate Kim Jong-in functions as a self-interested, entrenched interest defensive alliance. I believe this group tends to strongly prefer dispersing responsibility precisely when responsibility is about to concentrate. If an external symbol is installed, immediate blame can shift from the leadership or factions onto the individual, and the group can buy time to reorganize party power and nomination structures. I also believe this group either cannot or does not want to hold the knife of nomination conflict and personnel overhaul through internal rules. If external authority is installed, it becomes easier to dilute internal responsibility with the phrase, "that person decided," and the temptation grows to seal conflict by force rather than resolve it by principle. I further believe this group has a strong tendency to ride media framing rather than accumulate policy capacity. A famous figure can attract short-term attention, but attention does not automatically transform into policy execution and institutional accumulation. So when the real goal becomes buying time, this is the kind of choice that gets made. The lesson from 2012 is that an emergency committee cannot simply stop a nomination war. The fact that clashes over nominations were reported and even resignation talk emerged shows that an emergency committee can become not a settler but a battlefield. Because nominations are a matter of political survival, even borrowing an external blade rarely removes conflicts of interest. It only tends to redirect them. The key point is not whether a specific individual was right or wrong, but that when an emergency committee moves by authority without rules, the party can sink into deeper distrust. The greater the authority, the stronger the backlash. The stronger the backlash, the more the emergency committee is pushed toward harsher decisions. And in the end, the organization's wounds can deepen. Therefore, the lesson left by 2012 is that the emergency committee's rules must come before the emergency chair's person. If standards and procedures are not disclosed, the emergency committee is likely to be misunderstood not as a reform body, but as a power adjustment body. The interpretation from 2016 is that crisis containment is not the same as constitutional repair. The Democratic Party's emergency leadership led the election, and there are reports that leadership structure and term issues later became political flashpoints. This suggests that while an emergency committee can function as a crisis containment tool, long-term institutional repair does not automatically follow. In addition, the fact that Kim Jong-in was called to represent a progressive party's crisis, even though he had a history of activity in conservative circles, suggests that, in a crisis, election techniques and short-term containment can be prioritized over ideological consistency. The more this calling pattern repeats, the more a party learns to depend on external injections rather than cultivate its own line and talent from within. In the end, the question this case raises is simple. Does the party have the capacity to cultivate people and accumulate policy on its own? If it cannot answer that question, any emergency committee is likely to leave another vacuum once it ends. The interpretation from 2020 to 2021 is that conditional authority breeds recurring conflict. In 2020, the future United Party's Kim Jong-in emergency leadership began operating in earnest, and reports confirmed that conditions such as full authority, term length, and the timing of the party convention became the center of controversy. This shows that an emergency committee can be both a crisis management body and a marketplace of authority bargaining. Public materials also confirmed that the Kim Jong-in structure continued into the People Power Party's emergency leadership. This flow suggests that the more person dependence strengthens in a crisis, the more the party's structure becomes dependent on one person's decisions rather than standing on institutions and teams. When such a structure repeats, an emergency committee is likely to become a constant staging ground for the next power reorganization. What the public wants is not power reshuffling, but outcomes for livelihoods and national security, and when the structure tilts toward power, public trust weakens again. The criteria for selecting the People Power Party's emergency chair are critical and must evaluate morality, ideological consistency, resilience, and execution together. I believe morality is not the question of having zero flaws, but whether the candidate consistently cuts conflicts of interest, does not evade public scrutiny, and admits and corrects wrongdoing when it exists. A person who places the duty to explain before the desire to hold power should be the starting point of an emergency committee. I believe the freedom conservative standard should be judged not by the volume of rhetoric, but by whether the candidate has consistently upheld constitutional order, the rule of law, liberty, markets, and security realism through policy, votes, and administration. The candidate must persuade the public through design and execution rather than agitation, and must present a direction for governing the nation rather than fueling internal power struggles. I believe resilience should be judged not by embellished stories, but by a record of producing outcomes under unfavorable conditions, keeping principles after failure, and demonstrating recovery capacity. I believe political competence should be judged not by verbal skill, but by the ability to coordinate interests, establish principles, organize conflict into rules, and connect decisions to execution. I believe practical experience should be verified by whether the candidate has handled organizations, budgets, law and personnel in reality, and whether the candidate can present a 100-day and one-year performance scoreboard immediately upon taking office and deliver results by appointing accountable implementers. My final proposal is to cut off the recycled recall of an old figure and to disclose a pool of alternatives. The key is not Kim Jong-in again, but a leader who meets the standards, and if we judge by standards, I believe the options are not empty. I believe there are already multiple leaders who are honest, capable, and able to represent the freedom conservative camp, and that figures such as former Minister Kim Moon-soo, former party leader Kang Jae-seop, Pastor Kim Jin-hong, and a KAIST professor such as Kim Seong-hoi can be discussed. What matters is not promoting a specific individual, but opening a selection process that the public can accept through transparent standards and transparent verification. If that process opens, the time-buying strategy of entrenched interests loses power, and the party can finally enter a path where it is evaluated by outcomes for livelihoods and national security. A truly self-correcting emergency chair must be appointed to block the reckless drive of the Lee Jae-myung government and the ruling party, and to protect at least the minimum level of national security and people's livelihoods. Thank you for watching Professor Nam Yong Lee's long-form editorial.